Welcome to Shop Talks. Shop Talks is a function of inkitchen.com, which is a free place to get information online, and we do things like these Shop Talks. Impressions Show, putting this on, and then Hanes and Hirsch Solutions are the other sponsors. So we got to thank them very much for this. So we got Bruce Basen from Saati, got Wendy from Newman Stretch Devices, and Lon Winters, who is the owner of Graphic Elements in Colorado. So we're going to talk about screen making today. We're going to talk a little bit about it, and we're going to have questions after. So we could talk for days, but this is going to be about 20 minutes or so of talking and then some questions, and then we'll also be around afterwards if you want to hit us up for information. Lon will be here all day. Yeah, Wendy too? Yeah. Bruce is over at the Saati booth around all day as well. All right, so screens. That's why they call it screen making. Screens are important, huh? Wendy, you want to talk a little bit about some of the important things about screen making?
Well, some of the most important things about screen making is to make sure whatever screen you're making, that they're all the same. You're trying to eliminate variables within your shop that could cause you problems. Screen tension is one of them. Number one topic. So it doesn't really matter what kind of screens you use. You should have a tension meter in your shop so you know what the tension is on every frame that you have, every screen. If you're going to do a 4-color job and you try to put 4 screens together that are 10 newtons difference, you're going to have a heck of a time registering that job, right?
So if you're new to this, newtons are a way of measuring screen tension, and you can't really measure it with your hands. When you first start, because a lot of screens you have are so terrible, you can maybe tell if they have tension or not.
But what about the quarter bounce?
Yeah, well, there's that too. But at any rate, a tension meter, and if you don't have one, a lot of times if you have a rep in your area, they will have one at least until you can get one and measure the tension of your screens. So screen tension is super important. Lon, you want to add a little bit about some important things about screens?
I'll back up just a little bit on the screen making. Screen printing is what it's called. From the 30,000-foot view, our business is based on art, and there's no question that's garbage in, garbage out type of business. Bad art never makes a good t-shirt. A bad composition is a bad composition. And a 72 DPI GIF is not going to print very well. But assuming we can agree on that, then there's one thing that the best printers in the world have in common, and that's that they make great screens. They may make them differently, they may believe in different approaches, but they make great screens. And that's kind of the one thing that the very best have in common. They may do a lot of things differently, but they make great screens. On the tension part of things, what you were talking about, I always say the only thing worse than low tension is variable tension. So when you go to that 4-color job and you set it up, if you've got a high tension screen and a low tension screen, they'll never register by definition. So even if you don't go high tension or you don't buy that as a solution, then you need everything to at least be the same tension or within a 5 newtons kind of thing. So having that tension meter gives you the ability to measure, and what gets measured gets done.
So Bruce works for Saati, and they actually sell mesh that goes on screens. What are people's options for screens?
Well, before I go through the options, we're talking screen tension, which is the integral part of screen printing. What you want is you're transferring your ink through the screen. If the screen is more like a printing plate, which is stable, the ink's going to shear off better and fall onto the substrate and give you a much cleaner, crisper print, which everybody wants. It doesn't mess up the art, doesn't, those are some of the important things. What you have with screen mesh is you have many different mesh counts, from 24 up to 580, 508. It's most of the textile guys are from 86 to 305. Now there's some other factors within all that. You have the mesh count, which is the number of threads per inch in each direction, and you have the thickness of the thread. Your standard 110 mesh is 110 threads this way and that way, and the standard mesh is usually about an 80 micron thread. Now there's other meshes out there which are thinner thread. So a 110 might have a 64 micron thread, which actually enables more ink to go through without mesh interference. If you're trying to get a higher detail, you don't want the mesh interference. That's why everybody starts going to a higher mesh count, because the thread is thinner. So you can get around there. What I tell people is, if your thread's an inch apart and you have an 80 micron thread, you have an open area like that. If you have a thinner thread, your open area is bigger, so you have the ink to go through there better without your mesh interference, which is a big part of getting higher resolution on your print. But as far as different mesh counts, it's important to have the right tension per mesh count. Now, it's also very good if you can actually put all your tensions the same with all your mesh counts to give a more stable and controlled print. Everybody wants to control their print. One of the things I like to show people is, if you don't have tension, if you take your finger and roll it around on your forearm, if it's really tight, nothing happens. If it's tight, you see the skin start turning over, which is the mesh, and that also affects your registration when you're starting to print. And you say, well, it's off on both sides. What do I do? I said, you probably don't have good tension on your screens, and your polyester thread is stretching. One of the things with threads is the better it can hold the tension for a long period of time is going to enable you to use your screens longer. Years ago, there was a lot more elasticity in the thread than there is now. Threads have gotten better and better, and you're able to get them more stable depending on the different ways to stretch. I think I'm going to pass this on.
All right, so there's a couple of options for screens, roller frames and rigid frames. That's pretty much it. So Wendy works for the placemaking roller frames. Why don't you talk about what those are, and then maybe Lon, you could talk about rigid frames and the advantages of those. Whatever you're going to do, Wendy and I were talking about this earlier, you got to have good frames, and that means using roller frames right, or that means using rigid frames right, and let's go over that.
Making them right, it's just making them all the same. Roller frames are retensionable aluminum frames. They are rollers instead of square pieces of aluminum. You stretch your mesh into it, and you can actually retension that mesh after it's been used. Of course, not with the image in it, but it allows you to stabilize that polyester fiber in that mesh to the point that you're not going to have any more relaxation. So it becomes a work-hardened screen, and will maintain that tension until the mesh is worn out.
And so without a stretcher, you can have good screens. So, I mean, you can get a roller table, it's called, and it makes it easier to retension them, but you can do it even without that. Is there any in the show here that they can see?
There are a couple of them in Saati's booth.
Okay, so you can see them. They're like a round pipe, and you loosen them, turn it, and you can tension that yourself. So that traditionally is the way I would say that really good printers can have really good screens all of the time.
You have control over what that screen's going to end up.
Lately, that was kind of the A game, and now people sometimes, I don't need roller frames. Yeah, and then I hear people saying, then I say, what do you do? And they don't have a very good answer, actually. So, Lon, if they do have rigid frames, what would that be like? And how would they do that well?
So you're the A game, the key word is retentionable. So if you think about our process, a lot of what we do is based on simple math. The tension dictates the amount of off-contact distance, which dictates the squeegee pressure that we need to transfer the ink. So lower tension means higher off-contact, means more pressure, means we drive the ink into the shirt. So tension is relative regardless whether you use retentionable frames or static frames, hence the need for a tension meter so you can at least measure those and create a space or a number that you're just going to have those remeshed. Maybe you buy them at 20, 25 newtons and you reuse them until they get to say 15 and then have them remeshed because that tension is going to make a difference. Again, by definition, the math changes on a lower tension screen compared to a higher tension screen, so that registration issue that you're getting on the top and the bottom can't be fixed.
So you keep the screen till it rips, right?
I think that's what I just said, yeah.
No, you don't, actually. So I'm in a lot of shops, I go to a lot of shops, and it seems like people do think that. So they only end up restretching their high meshes, which tend to rip more, but it matters, obviously. The lower meshes are the ones that put the underprint down, etc. So if you're going to do a good job restretching a rigid frame, what do you do?
There are services available.
All right, that's number one.
Number one.
So, we use a lot of GSF frames. That's what we're printing the posters with. You can send a pallet of those back and they'll restretch them. Does Saati do that too? Yeah, Saati. Talk to Bruce about that. You either got to send them back or you got to have, I'd say, I don't know, what's your stretcher cost? That's probably the lowest end of a really good one. Maybe 10 grand or something like that. All right, you got to pay at least, so you got to at least spend that much if you're going to retension your rigid frames. So you either got to send them back or you got to get a good stretcher. You cannot stretch them with your hands. You cannot stretch them with a crappy stretcher. You'll get crappy prints, I guarantee you. Can we agree on that?
We can agree.
So you either got to have a retentionable screen that you then actually retension, or you have to have a rigid frame that you either send back to a reputable place or do it yourself with an expensive stretcher. Beyond that, no other way.
I'll throw a caveat in there too with the retentionable frames. If you don't retention them, they're harder to use than rigid frames. That is a step that you must handle through the process. If you don't do that, you're going to have bigger problems than running rigid frames.
You got to stay on them. Yes, that was the comment. Yes, definitely. All right. So how about
just because somebody says they do restretches for frames, people do them in different ways. There are people that have crappy stretchers, and there's people that have good stretchers. Good stretchers actually let the mesh relax a little bit before they're gluing them down, which enables it to hold tension longer. If you take a polyester thread and stretch it, it eventually gets to the point where you lose a lot of the elasticity, which you want to do. That's what the roller frames do in the proper way to tension those. That, along with the threads, have gotten better over the years, but the more they can let it sit and relax and have under tension more is what you want to do, is get the elasticity out of the thread.
That's good. Let's talk just a little bit about coating screens. So what's sort of the way to get consistent frames if you don't have a lot of money, and what if you do?
Automatic coating, of course, gives you the most consistent deposit of emulsion when you're coating, and then you can set it for whatever your needs might be, 2 and 2, 2 and 1.
In reality, when you're for a textile guy, we're working with EOM, emulsion over mesh, or emulsion thickness on the print side of the screen, and you want to get between 10 and 20% depending on your different mesh counts. And that's one thing that the consistency of a coating machine will get you, because we all know if you're coating a screen, there's a point where your muscle changes, and mentally you have to adjust tension and pressures to try and keep that consistent emulsion thickness.
One thing we've had people do is set up a jig if they can't justify the cost of automatic coating. You can buy them as well. I think Vastex has a pretty clever one, and used
We
to
have
be-
one on a spring, so you put the screen down and it holds it, and then you can coat it with two hands,
Using
which is
two hands.
easier. A lot of people can coat with one hand too, though. But then you kind of want to have a table and something to brace it on. And honestly, I find if you have only one or two people coat in your shop, that's
For
a
sure.
definite advantage. That you want consistency, and you really can't see that consistency. It's really hard to measure. So just know that if you have the same person doing it in the same way with the same emulsion, it's going to come out more consistent. And then also, if you have roller frames, make sure they're stretched right because it's going to coat right.
Absolutely, it'll be different. The higher the tension, the less emulsion is gonna stay on the screen. So you need to adjust your coating method when you have a higher tension screen. Right.
For sure, we work with several mesh manufacturers from thin thread to high tension. So we've got meshes in the 25 range all the way to the 50 range, newtons that is. And we have to coat differently for the thin thread mesh than we do the high tension mesh. We go as much as 2 and 3 on a dual cure to get a 15-20% EOM on a 166, say.
All right. I think the only other thing I wanted to add was I think the size of the screen helps. The bigger you can fit on your machine or use, the more sweet spot there is. So if you're trying to print with really small screens, the closer you get to the edge of the screen, the worse results you will get. Certainly on a Newman roller frame in the corners, that's not a good place to be, and even on a rigid frame, it isn't.
I would just say that sweet spot is critical in that a smaller frame really limits your ability to do even standard size prints, because a standard pallet anymore is 16-22 smallest, and if you want to go out to the edges on say 15 inches wide, you don't want to probably use an 18-20 frame. It's going to be real hard because your tension is real high next to the frame. So back to the math again, we're not able to get the squeegee to penetrate or to make contact with the substrate when it's close to the edges. So if we can go larger frame, gives us a bigger sweet spot.
All right. Any questions about screen making? Anything?
What's your position on the panels?
So the question is, what about panels? And you mean screen panels. So I want to explain what screen panels are.
Well, a screen panel it's a piece of mesh that's cut to the frame size. It has the strips already on it. It's got a reverse curve built in to give you consistent tension when you stretch on a larger screen. The corners are pre-softened, which tends to be, when you are stretching a screen, the corners, the fibers in the corner are shorter than anywhere else on that screen. So those corners have to have excess fabric in the corner in order for you to get up to the tension that you want in the center of the screen. So with a panel, all of that guesswork is done. So panels are amazing if you have multiple people stretching screens because it's repeatable. I don't care how many different people are doing it, it's repeatable because it takes the guesswork out.
Yeah, so we use panels. One is you really don't want to have experts. You want to cross-train. It's easier to train people. So this is only for roller frames or retensionable frames that you're talking about.
Well, actually, they got it for
Oh, they do have for...
Snap frames.
Oh, right,
yeah, right.
okay.
I wanted to bring that up. I mean, I didn't at first, but I know rollers here, but I have some Sherlocks with panels, and I did that purely from sitting with you guys saying my tension sucks, and I tried some rollers. They didn't fit in my stuff, like my situation. So the Sherlocks for me, I said, let me try some of those, and I'm in the 40s in my tension, and I'm using them. They seem to stay well.
All right, so the question or comment is that he uses panels and it seems to help keep good tension. I think that's true. And then they're easier to stretch. I think that's true.
For sure. We work with customers that do the Sherlock panels, and truth be told, they started the panels for the roller frames as well. We use roller frames with the panel system, but we have customers that have run the Sherlock with the panels as well. I would say the advantage would be that there's square frames, so you're not wrestling learning digital with round frames and corners, soft corners, so they are a little bit easier to kind of wrap your head around when you're first learning. Something is better than nothing. I would rate them second to roller frames, but it's still better than static frames because you've got that control over tension. That's just my personal opinion. For sure.
Comment is they print better than statics.
And one of the things you have is when you tell people the price of the panel, they say, they get scared. Well, it's expensive. Well, you start looking at time versus money, and you say, first of all, anybody could do it because it's inserting the panel correctly, and just if it's what kind of frame do you have? A Sherlock or the Eco frame that Nortec makes, the roller frame, you get that panel in there quickly. That saves an awful lot of time and everything's squared up because you want everything X and Y. You don't want anything on a bias anymore. So that's an important factor.
So if you're new to screen printing, this whole thing is about like how you get the mesh onto the frame. So any other questions? What kind of screen do you use when you want a library of the screen? The one you get the best deal on.
Yeah, we were talking about how the mesh is unstable early. There's a risk with librarying screens. We have customers that library thousands, and you kind of get a big eye roll when we walk in. It's a big investment, and probably with the systems and the approaches today, I would recommend a reclaim system, unless you know you're getting a reorder next week and I can sit on these and set it up kind of thing. If everything's a rotating, you might consider a transfer application for something like that. It's not something I'm comfortable saying, hey, this is what you should do if you want a library screen, so I'll defer.
I definitely agree with Lon. There's a couple factors. It's going to lose tension over time. Frame just sits there. The other thing is how much you pay him per square foot. I mean, like he said, you walk into a shop, they got 1,000 frames.
What if it's not that many? What would you do to library the screens?
In that case, I'd have to say that buy quality mesh, quality frame, and if it's not that many, then make sure that you're fully exposed, and the tension meter piece of it is making sure that you hold your manufacturer accountable for if they say they're at 2025, you got to measure them to make sure that they really are at 2025. And if you get something that's not, send it back and get another one. You want those to be similar in tension, so when you do pull them down off the shelf, they'll register again the next time.
No, and I think it probably works better when you have really simple designs that are one or two colors, not multicolor. I think you're asking for trouble. But simple things, yeah, you can. I think you want probably a good screen anyway, because otherwise it's going to not store for very long and it's going to not work on that level as well as whether you were reclaiming it or not. You still want a decent frame. Retentionable or not, I think you want a rigid frame if you're going to catalog it, I would say, for sure. Yes. All right, so the question is, she started with wooden frames and now has gone to aluminum frames. And then is there a question or just a comment? What do you do with the wooden ones? Get a fire pit.
Campfire, they burn hot.
I walked into some shops that have used wooden frames years ago, and they've actually put old designs of shirts on the frame and stapled them there and have them on their wall now. So there's your frame.
I have one actually above my desk that I made by hand. Yes. I printed a lot of shirts with it, but not very well. Other questions or comments? Guys mostly already screen printing or thinking of getting into it? You are screen printers? I looked like you had pretty good forearms. I figured done some manual printing back there.
I know we were talking about screen tension a lot here and the type of frames. If you're doing reclaim, one of the most important things to do, your final step in reclaim, is to give your screen a good gravity rinse of water to get as much of that stuff off of there as you can, because that'll affect your emulsion adhering to each other. If you have degreasers, just about every chemical out there has a degreaser in there that you're using for reclaim, whether it's an ink remover or emulsion remover. So it degreases the screen. Now, what happens with the screen is the thread is polyester. Most emulsion is basically 50% water. Water doesn't really want to adhere to polyester, because if you're painting with some latex paint, you put a plastic cloth down and you drip some, you can actually pull it back. They have products out there which are, that actually will degrease and prep the mesh, which makes basically changes the dye level, or it makes the polyester thread, it changes it a little bit so the emulsion will adhere to the thread as opposed to just the emulsion on the other side, which will give you a little bit better screen as far as stop and breakdowns. So that's something, but most important thing is to give it a good gravity rinse before you dry it. And if you use gravity as opposed to pressure, because when you use pressure, water starts flying up in the air and things like that. So try and give it a good gravity rinse. I suggest people just have a regular hose with a little on-off and just from the top down and let everything drip. So that's just a little tip that helps people.
Any other questions?
The proper way to use the Newton gauge, where and how to check that tension on that.
All right, so the question is how to use a Newton meter to measure your frames. How do you do that?
We have 9 points in the center of the frame, so you're going to be 3 to 4 inches from the inside edge of that frame all the way around. You can't get too far into the corner where the corner's soft, and you don't want to get too close to the roller because it's going to be a lot tighter. But there's a sweet spot right in the middle that we've been talking about, and that's the area where you want your tension to be consistent.
So in about an area, the sweet spot, it's like where our screen travels, somewhere's in there, 4 or 5 different sides, so all of it's within 5.
So the question is, so you check maybe 5 or so places and you make sure it's maybe within 5 newtons of where you want it.
I would go 5 newtons from screen to screen, but from in the same screen, you want to be plus or minus 1 or 2 probably.
Right, that's what I meant.
And what she's talking about, the sweet spot, you've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and probably if you're on say a 2331, you probably got 15 inches by 18 inches in that range.
And you do want to check your tension meter every once in a while. We had huge problems once, and we were wondering why we were blowing the screens, and ours was off by 10 newtons. I learned a hard lesson that time. No, yes, yeah. So what you want to do is usually you can send it back like you guys redo them at Stretch Devices. But an easier way is just when a traveling person comes in your shop, that's selling you something. Like if Bruce comes in your shop, make him get his out and make sure it's the same as what you're getting, because they can be way off, and then you'll have hell to pay. So you think you're being all careful, and you're fucked.
Once they're dropped, you're ultra, don't.
Fucked.
If they wobble on the glass, they're probably not any good, so you need to have them recalibrated.
Right. Other questions? All right. Well, we'll be around if you want to ask. If you're shy and want to ask us in person. Lon will be here all day. I'll be here all day. Bruce will be all day on the other. Wendy's walking around. So I'm sure any of us can answer any questions that you might have. If you want to stick around in a few minutes, Michelle Moxley, this is kind of the boring backside of what you do. Super important, but not really that exciting. Totally front end. Michelle has got some mind-blowing prints, which I'm guessing she used some decent screens to come up with. So anyway, if you want to stick around from that, I'm telling you, mind-blowing prints next. Anyway, I want to thank Bruce and Wendy and Lon. Have a little hand for them. I want to thank Hanes and Hirsch and Impressions for bringing this on. Thanks.